Welcome to the Stoa, a place where thinkers of many different styles meet to explore new ideas and experiment with different practices and dialogue about what matters most. In case you didn't see the notification when you joined, the session will be recorded. So if you don't want to appear on YouTube, feel free to leave your camera off. But for everyone else, we'd love to see your face. We're going to start this 60-minute session with Jamie Wheal, exploring a little bit about where he's come from, give you some context on Jamie as a person, and then we'll hopefully guide this conversation into something a bit more edgy. What matters? What's the conversation that we want to have here today? So I'll ask a couple of questions to start things off, and then we'll invite everybody else here to pop some questions into the chat. And I'm happy to call on you if we select your question, and you can unmute yourself and read that to Jamie. And if you don't want to read your question out loud, feel free to just send your message as a private message to me, and I'm happy to read it for you as well. So I guess without further ado, thanks so much, Jamie, for joining us. I've read your book, Stealing Fire, and that really got me interested in a lot of different domains and communities that I hadn't been super curious about before. And then reading your more recent book, Recapture the Rapture, I can see just how quickly your thinking has evolved in this space. I'd love to hear just a little bit about what are some of the spaces that you've explored that have brought you to where you are today, and how would you even describe where your thinking is these days?
Well, I would say post-tragic radical hope is the TLDR of it all for where I am, and I think where I will be for the duration. The zones of inquiry and exploration for me have always been kind of twofold. One is sort of rigorous academics and scholarship. So kind of went straight from undergrad to grad school, was kind of done on all my doc work at 22, just had a dissertation to write. And then at the same time, I was living in the mountains in Colorado, and I came down to class one day in the spring, and one of my professors looked at she looked at me, she goes, "Why are your hands so tan?" And it was because we'd been backcountry skiing with our gloves off in the spring. And I was like, oh, this isn't going to work, is it? Like I'm not cut out to spend the rest of my life in the basement of a library poring over tax records, but love reading and studying this stuff. So I'm super grateful someone's doing it, but that is just not going to, like, primary documentary evidentiary research isn't my jam. But in that study, I was fascinated by fundamentally the kinds of questions that Yuval Harari and now David Getz with his Dawn of Everything book that's just recently come out, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Like, that was literally, like, if you go to the bibliography of Guns, Germs, and Steel, like, that was my academic study realm. And it was to try and answer the question, which had largely kind of come through psychedelic gallivanting and university and everything else, which was, wait a sec, if this realm of goodness, truth, and beauty exists, but it sure as hell doesn't seem like it's showing up in daytime, where did we go wrong? Where did Western Civ go off the rails? Was there a fork in the road and we need to backtrack? And so I was particularly interested in kind of historical anthropology. So, looking at human civilization and culture balanced with the experience of human consciousness and developmental theory and all those kinds of things. And was there a road less traveled? And should we go back and find it? And if so, where and how? And so that kind of then, so that was the academic scholarly stuff. And that led to comparative religion, that led to all sorts of just kind of ongoing inquiries in culture. And at the same time, I was also super, just drawn to adventure in big, wild places. So everything from wilderness medicine and surf rescue to mountaineering and ski mountaineering and guiding and those kinds of things. And, and through line, not to, I don't know what, either totally discredit myself or do whatever, but also psychedelics in big, badass, wild, natural places. And it wasn't until I read James Arick's piece in the MAPS Bulletin about psychedelic Rocky Mountain culture and how there was this, which was just the community we were part of. But he's like, yeah, there's this little known fucking scene from like Telluride, Taos to Telluride to Aspen to Crested Butte, Jackson Hole, Boulder, all of these places where people are routinely doing what would be called normally museum dose psychedelics, and then putting up the most insane extreme routes and doing rad adventure stuff, whether that's paragliding, rock climbing, boating, backcountry skiing, whatever. And at the same time, there was this beautiful communal ritual baked into those towns, which was, late night throwdowns, full moon tribal stomps to the sort of new grass, bluegrass, Grateful Dead culture, string cheese incident, these kind of things. So we would live and die in the backcountry, bury friends, have funerals, avalanches, rockfalls, drownings. Like Kali was absolutely present in that world. And at the same time, ecstatic communal celebration and connection to nature. And what I didn't realize until the last, probably decade of sort of seeing transformational culture, transformational festivals, Burning Man community, all the things kind of bubbling up, and also all the new age narcissistic aberrations of those things, is how lucky we were, because we got those experiences of profound embodiment, natural sublime, kind of, Whitman to Muir to Thoreau to, the sort of barbaric yawping of the thing, as well as this particularly antinomian Gnostic culture that came out of the Grateful Dead DNA, which was, the beauty of their stance was no one grabs the one ring of power. And like even baked into their lyrics, like if I knew the way, I would take you home. It was this trickster, what me worry, uniquely American Gnosticism. And just to look back on all that and be like, oh shit, that was really, really fortunate to have that combination of experiences that never led to gurus, never led to excess magical thinking, was always gravity tested. So there was a limit to how much you could just sit on a cushion and bullshit. And it was just a profoundly beautiful way to come of age and grow up, really. And so profoundly grateful for it. And that's precisely what we're still doing today. I mean, our life has just come absolutely full circle, and we're building an off-grid cabin at 10,000 feet near Crested Butte, which we always wanted. I was just like, give me a mining claim and a yurt and a couple of solar panels, and I'll be happy riding and skiing, and hanging out. And we had a 76 Westphalia camper. We used to spend 4 months a year adventuring through the Pacific Northwest. And now we're fitting out a Sprinter van because they're safer, and Flow Genome Project, the work we do in training, we just came off, a couple of weeks of guiding in the Utah canyons, but now with Suzanne Cook-Reuter's developmental map model, and every single day is a different level of consciousness, and leading people through those kinds of things. So, I'm super grateful to just, I suppose, have the dawning gratification that our life actually hasn't changed, and the things that we cared about and found precious in our 20s, and a plural is my partner Julie and I and our kids, but we met when we were in college, so we've been on this ride together. So that's it. It's just figuring out, what does it mean to come alive, stay alive, and how do we do this human thing, and balance profound experience with fun, exploratory, relevant scholarship.
Oh, that's been such a journey. That's what I'm hearing, at least. And I'm thinking about in my own life, just how to combine the real richness of getting outdoors, or the actual practice, but also discussions like these ones as well. And I'm aware that you've been doing a bunch of traveling, and I imagine that you have a bunch of sort of talks like this one where you get to have these different conversations as well. I'm curious about your thoughts about finding that real embodied practice, or cultivating your own ecosystem of practices, but also having these kinds of discussions. Like, curious about your thoughts there.
Just go ahead and refine that question a bit, so I just answer it as directly as I can.
Yeah. So I guess, like, when is thinking and talking too much? And when do you kind of just got to get outside and experience something?
Shut the fuck up and play, right? I mean, I always think of like the Ken Kesey, right? The Merry Pranksters, electric acid test, that whole thing, right? I mean, he was the word bard, right? He had logos on lock, and he was a super charismatic leader. And then they got together with the Grateful Dead, and at some point it was like all that talking and all the weird feedback loops and crazy film projectors and all the stuff that the pranksters were doing just gave way to Jerry Garcia and his guitar. So I really, do think, like, and again, not to be quoting out of the hymn book, right? But I mean, one of their lines is, if you get confused, listen to the music play, right? So there is something profoundly important about the limits of language and the limits of rhetoric and rumination and pontification. And for sure, I mean, I was just trying to listen. Actually, somebody had just sent me John Vervaeke's bit with Jordan Peterson lately, and maybe a bishop and somebody else, and they were talking about meaning and faith. And as much as I value and appreciate all the conversations and all their inquiry, I couldn't listen. I'm just like, and I can't, like, even to friends of mine right now that many are, guests of the Stoa and other things. But when it, especially when guys, but like when they start spinning up and spinning up and spinning up into an abstraction on top of an abstraction on top of a hypothesis, it feels disconnected to me from life and roots and heart and application. And I become enervated. Like I have to burn calories to stay engaged. And at some point, I just assume rather not. So I think that, in fact, there was and I don't remember the name, but there was a recent debate coming out of COP26 in Glasgow. And there was a Harvard woman professor in the climate space. And she basically said, hey, the time for modeling is done. We know enough now. And there was kind of, an predictable Twitter back and forth and this kind of stuff. But her point was, like, we know the stakes. We know the hour is late. We should be putting our efforts and energies into mitigations and subsequent action. And I could really sympathize with that, because it feels like there's been so long, decades, from, let's say, the early 70s and maybe Club of Rome, take your pick, like, what are limits to growth, whatever we want to do. At some point we were like, oh shit, we might be cooking our goose, and then there's just been decades of mulling precisely the water temperature and the seasonings and the farm to table origins of that goose. And then what are we going to do with it? Are we going to stuff it? Are we going to butterfly it? And what are we going to serve for dessert? Fucking hell, man, our goose is cooked. So the time now is to actually transition, I think, from, what we were talking about just before we went live, which is a sort of a version of existential scholasticism, counting, devils on the heads of pins. How many different ways can this go sideways? Into realizing, hey, I probably know enough to want to take steps to stabilize my life, to simplify my life, to vitalize my relationships and my connections, and to valorize my stand on behalf of a greater collective. And then let's just fucking get going on that, because it feels like we're all fibrillating between bored and frantic right now, and in some weird way almost wishing this old gamish a world would just be done already, so that we could step across that threshold into a life that matters, and into a world where we reassert or find our agency. So yeah, I'm a big fan of let's get stuff done now.
And I've got just one more question along this lines, and I'm starting to see some questions coming into the chat, so feel free to put more in there. I'm hearing a bit of a polarity between sort of like the thinking and the doing. And what I'm hearing is that you're witnessing in a number of communities, and maybe within our own lives, that there seems to be a bit too much leaning onto the thinking and the talking. I'm curious if you found any ways that you found really promising for sort of breaking out of that dynamic and starting to explore that more acting space.
Yeah, I will defer to Wendell Berry on this one. So long as they do not go cheap for power, trust women more than men. I mean, dig in the garden, build things, look after children and elders. This isn't complicated. Unraveling the clusterfuck late stage capitalism and postmodern consumer society is a little complicated at first, or you just Gordian knot the thing and cleave it and move on. But really, I think the simplest is to go back to what are timeless cross-cultural components of a healthy and vibrant culture, and run down the checklist of those things. Like, are we feeding the holy? Are we grieving holy? Do we have rituals of forgiveness? Do we celebrate and praise? Do we renew? Do we honor? Right? Do we teach? Do we protect? Do we have the shamans and the healers and the artists and the warriors? Right? And and if you're doing something with NFTs or doing digital brand management strategies for an app someplace that from your beach Wi-Fi in Tulum, you might be like, hey, maybe I'm a few degrees disconnected from being a hominid on this earth. And how do we just not in a retro romantic way, but just in a kind of commonsensical way, get back to that. And that's, having said all that, if I sound remotely anti-intellectual, I'm also ginning up a super geeked out steep study of back to my academic roots. So like the Vaclav Smil's new book on the great transitions, where he talks about the energy transition, the food transition, the population transition. Like, that's a rad book of like anthropologist from space. Like, what are these humans doing on this little blue marble? And then gets his Dawn of Everything as another kind of counterintuitive, and just kind of taking a look at basically big or long history, because all of our stories right now are collapsing and probably should. And so the questions are, is many people are coming in with alternate, quite often toxic or damaging alternate histories or explanations. So you think about Steve Bannon and his adherence with the fourth turning and accelerationists and all this kind of, like, there's a lot there. There's a mythopoetic vacuum right now. And it's also where I think Jordan Peterson has received so much, like, he was a nutrient that was missing, to many young men and others, who were like, give me meaning, give me structure, give me, right, some form of trustworthy patriarchal authority that was also connected to the magico mystical. And in that respect, I think just getting really clear on, did that whole enlightenment story actually work? In fact, Tyson Yunkaporta, who I think your folks may also be familiar with, he and I are going to have a jam at some point soon on basically like the Western Enlightenment, like what to kill and what to keep, and like is democracy a good thing? Is representative democracy better than direct democracy? Private property, is that a good thing? Civil rights, all these things, the market, like what of these were great ideas badly executed or captured? What of them were kind of shitty ideas to start with and we're just wrapped with a bunch of fancy philosophy, and we're just basically colonialism getting ramrodded through? Like, are there gems in the rotting hulk of this giant mansion, or do we just burn it down? Because there's a lot of folks saying burn it down right now. And before we do, which would be super gratifying and satisfying in a kind of punk rock vandal kind of way, but on the other hand, there's a lot of bloodshed and suffering spilled for these things. And if we burn it all down, then everything was in vain. But on the other hand, are there these beautiful ideas, which is what I wrote about in Recapture the Rapture, of like the infinite game? Is there something critical here that is not always talked about or championed, that is essential, so that we don't just go back down the slide and to cover, look after my own tribalism?
Thank you. I'll pass to Peter, who's got a question in the chat as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Narayan, and thanks, Jamie, for returning to the Stoa. Yeah, I want to double click on something you said and perhaps like seek your advice on something. And since I have host access, I'm going to actually share my screen. And there's a meme on Twitter I saw recently that I quite liked. So here's like some guy, me planning for retirement. And then, there's like some kind of, heaven state, and then like collapse of society. And I feel like this is sort of like, me for most decisions these days, where I feel like at my best, I'm playing the infinite game. I feel a sense of aliveness, creating the new thing. But then there's this sense that something fucked up and bad's going to happen that I'm ill prepared for. And then there's like a fear enters my body. Like, especially I think this is a common thing with a lot of people in our space who are aware of existential risk, meta crisis, and stuff like that. Um, I don't know if you said it. I kind of quote you saying this, but it's like I think I heard you say it's like in the future the sage and the prepper are going to be like hard to tell apart, because the wise person is going to have to prepare for some kind of collapse scenario. Um, so I'm curious how you personally kind of like balance the awareness of how bad shit could happen, but still be playing the infinite game, and perhaps use the awareness as a forcing function to pay it quite well. And what would your advice be for us who have this dilemma where fear invokes the body and makes us play finite games, or encourages us to play more finite games?
Mm. Hmm. Well, that'll easily take us to the top of the hour, and then some. But I mean, fundamentally, I'd encourage folks to wrap their heads around um, thinking errors and thinking traps. So, Deep Survival is a book by Lawrence Gonzalez and the subtitle is "Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why." And start wrapping our head around like the heuristic biases, like the rules of thumb that lead us astray in critical situations. And they use stuff for everything from hard landings in aircraft, like airline passengers who, the plane is on fire, the landing gear is wrecked, it's a crash landing with fire trucks and everything else. And people are still going to the overhead bin to get their roll off because that's what one does when one leaves the airplane, don't you? Or the first plane slammed into the World Trade Tower and other people in the second one are still completing emails because that must have been a freaking other people are hauling ass down the stairs going, this is something bigger. So the ability to alter habituated behaviors, the ability to recognize the severity of the situation sooner than non-survivors, right? And the ability to respond adaptively are all hallmarks of, and the ability to not bend the map, which is, actually a chapter in that book that's so good that we use it in our backcountry courses. And Zach over here, and at least in my top corner, just came off one of those courses, right? But the idea of bending the map is a phrase that orienteers use when you're lost, where you don't know where you are, and you bend the map. You're like, that rock right there on the map must be this one, because then that means that camp is just around the corner, but it's not. And what happens as we move between worlds and we move between maps, and what is that? And it even goes back to the Old English and the Germanic of like bewilderment means to be left, to be lost in the forest. So we are bewildered right now, and to not know where we are is a form of annihilation. So the super quick and dirty is do the 80-20 now. Like if you don't want, and in fact, our wilderness medical trainer, who was an Everest, base camp doctor, said this when we were training. He's like, no matter what, you got to remember this. You got me first, me second, me third, my partner's fourth, the victim's fifth. And at the time, I was young and idealistic and wanted to, put on the Superman cape and go help people in fires or avalanches or whatever. I was like, that seems so cold and heartless, you bastard. And then he explained it. He's like, look, if you just rush in where angels fear to tread, right, you are going to become another victim. Now you've completely fucked your partner, right? And you had an asymmetrical amount of knowledge and capacity that is now offline and not available to anyone. And no matter how heart-wrenching it is, the victims, either by poor misfortune or choice or fate, right, are already victims. And you adding your name to that list changes nothing and actually makes things worse. So the 80-20, what we would sort of playfully call like prepstering, like prepping for hipsters, like how to get ready for woolly times without losing your cool, is again, I mean, drawing on mountain guiding kind of stuff, food, clothing, shelter, medicine, maps, communication, right? And if you have those things, then you're kind of good to go through all sorts of woolly times. If you don't have even one or two of those things, you are limping back to the trailhead, to civilization, to someone else, and you're a victim now. So the biggest advice I would have for anybody in communities like this, right? Sort of folks that are considered, they are trying to make sense of things, they are trying to follow good discernment and trying to sift wheat from chaff and trying to get clear fucking signal. And if you're doing it for yourselves, you're almost certainly responsible for half a dozen to dozens to thousands of other people, right? That you're either leading directly or who look to you in some way, right? Is the 80-20 thing. Do the 20% of the actions that cover 80% of your ass now, and batten down, like make sure your house is in order so that you can come back to this mass casualty event, right? And be useful. Because what we can't have is the people who are most capable, either in thought, word, or deed, whatever their contribution is, they're holding something important, and like we need them to solve this, to help solve it, right? But they're getting increasingly schizophrenic, right? Between, do I stay here on this mission-driven service, or do I go back to look after my family? Do I go back, right, to make sure we've got a base? And so the idea is like everybody should be going back to their bases right now. If the last 18 months hasn't twigged folks onto that, it is past time to find your spot, connect with your folks, and put your house in order on basic levels of common sense resiliency. Like, what on earth happens when 911 and my fucking Uber Eats app stop working? Just run that scenario, and let's all get there super fast. And then, to the extent that we have additional capacity, show up. So I guess my biggest encouragement is that old, kind of Whole Foods bumper sticker of like, think globally, act locally. We can update it and we can say grieve globally and thrive locally. So pay attention to the state of things and weep. Don't whimper, fucking drop to our knees and weep for all that is to be lost, right? And absolutely plan for vibrant, resilient local community. And we were just talking, Peter, I think you were just talking about being in Portugal and this kind of stuff. And something I've noticed in the last 6 months, visibly, it's been going on for longer, is a bunch of people who I thought had kind of picked their seats, for when the music stops, whether it's New Zealand or Maui or Kauai or BC or whatever, are actually all having or Baja, like they're all having like second guess moments and then ripping around the world again right now and swapping notes on Portugal. What about that golden visa? I'm kind of curious about, and so and my sense is like, look, it's not about, and actually this was seconded by our executive director at the Flow Genome Project, who's a former SEAL Team 6 commander. So he spent time in East Africa, Joint Special Operations Command. So very, very rooted in like thriving with love through instability. And we were agreed, it's kind of like this, it's a Venn diagram of, it's the place. Yeah, for sure. It's the place, but it's not just the place. It's the people. What's your social capital and social network? And then arguably your palace. What is your actual home place? Like, how resilient is it? Does it have solar power? Does it have wind power? Does it have hydro? Does it have a ham radio? Does it have all those things? And so, but it's an intersection of those three. It's not that New Zealand saves my ass, because New Zealand is a struggling, it's a human place with lots of humans and overlays of colonialism and isolationism and all sorts of things. And the idea of like, I saw Lord of the Rings and that looked cool, and I heard Peter Thiel was there, maybe he'll be my neighbor, is going to be far less resilient than if you look at all three. And really, and what Kurt, my partner, was saying, he said, like, I'll choose people all day long. So like find the ones you love and love the ones you're with. And let's go build stuff, because the beauty of it is it doesn't need to come from fear or scarcity. I mean, my wife is a Montessori teacher. We built an integral Montessori school for our kids. We spent lots of time guiding in the wilds of the world, and anything that we would recommend right now is exactly what we were recommending 25 years ago, because it's fun and it's hands-on and it's empowering and it's sustainable and it's inspiring it to learn and it's empowering to do, and it's super cool. So like, it's no downside. Like if you go to stringing razor wire and improvise explosive devices around your perimeter and and you're stocking up on ammo, like that's fear-based, like lifeless, like literally, it's kind of sucking the life out of ourselves and everybody else. But if you're in we're going to thrive locally. And what does that mean? To have a self-sufficient, independent, sustainable footprint, that is nothing but upside. And why aren't we doing it anyway?
excellent advice. Thank you. Definitely going to have like a hipster preppers in here at the stoa now. So it's definitely needed.
I'd super recommend. There's actually a brilliant little essay called "The Long Disaster" by one of the founders of Burners Without Borders. So it's the Burning Man community that does Doctors Without Borders around the world. And it's just as concise as it could possibly be. It's like 2,000 words and just super both open-hearted and practical, but also, I think it just does a great job bridging the highest heights of transformational culture and community with getting stuff done in rugged places.
What you're saying is totally resonating with me. I'm like, Jamie, are you listening to some of the conversations that I'm having with my community? And yeah, really interesting. I'll pass things to Oslam. I think your question is actually quite related, so I'd love to hear that.
Yes, in fact, I'm going to expand my question beyond Julie. Hi, Jamie. And partners and devoted people that you're devoted in your life, and then their role. So you've just given a great overview of your journey, and then I just wanted to integrate, even though you've definitely mentioned that, but could you comment more about that special partnership, doing it alone versus, as Kurt said, just choosing your people and doing together, or the unification? And just please add as much as you like, including sacred relationships.
Well, that's a whole another beautiful thing. And yes, my partner's sitting here right beside me on a big comfy chair in our library. So look, I don't know. I mean, the case I make in Recapture the Rapture is it has to start with dyads. And that, it can be any gender combination, any, humans are humans and we get to love whoever we love. So amen to all of that. And evolution through the kitchen sink at pair bonding. So if we can't figure that one out, we are much harder pressed to figure it out in larger numbers with weaker evolutionary or neurobiological incentive, which is the very unromantic way of describing it, right? The heartfelt way is just, this is how we've always done the human thing. And it feels super important to go. In fact, I'll tell you what, this was a Joni Mitchell quote that I just came across this morning, and it's so beautiful. And then it had an interesting backstory. So I'll tell, this is the quote she said. She said, "I recently read an article in Esquire magazine called The End of Sex that said something that struck me as very true. It said, if you want endless repetition, see a lot of different people. If you want infinite variety, stay with one. What happens when you date is you run all your best moves and tell all your best stories. And in a way, that routine is a method for falling in love with yourself over and over. You can't do that with a longtime mate because they know all that old material. With a long relationship, things die, then are rekindled. And that shared process of rebirth deepens the love." So, and this is not, if anybody is not in a relationship that feels like that, please just, huge, ample space to, either find one or chart a totally different path. All I can speak to is the accident of our life. But my sense is that it's not so much about monogamy or serial monogamy or celibacy or polyamory or whatever relational format fits for folks. We're all 21st century consenting adults at this point, so we're kind of past traditional cultural taboos and shaming and norming. And on the other hand, I think the question of hierosgamos, like sacred union, sacred communion, or hierogamy, like literally, what is that higher spot we can do in intimate relationship with another, is arguably the ball game, and potentially one of, if not the most powerful way for us to experience peak states that remind us of our purpose, being, and also illuminate our wounding. and provide the support and energy to do the mending, and provide a connection, because we are social tribal primates, and and how we do this thing in small is how we do this thing at large.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it to Tom for the next question.
Hi, Jamie. It's Tom Beekman in Toronto. What you say about sort of living rather than spending your time thinking resonates so much with me, because I love doing all the things you mentioned: hiking, backcountry skiing, building stuff, and cooking, and writing, and playing sports. And I particularly love those things, and derive a lot of satisfaction from them when I'm doing them with other people. But it strikes me in the education system right now, and maybe for the last while, there's been a trend away from those things, and a trend towards sort of filling in multiple choice tests, and a trend towards knowledge and facts, sort of, if you like, to the digital world, and away from practice and learning the craft skills. So I guess my question is, do you agree with that for a start? And how can we reverse the trend? Because I mean, we depend so much, I guess, on future generations, and it strikes me that one of the reasons they're losing direction is because they're spending too much time sort of in the digital world and not enough time in the real world.
I mean, yes, times 1,000, right? I mean, mine and Julie's life was as alternative educators. So everything from wilderness education to, as we said, Montessori, to helping advise the Acton Business School, which is here in Austin, which I think Jordan Peterson said was one of the only graduate programs in the country that was, sort of in keeping with the kind of hero's journey and that kind of stuff. So really kind of cradle past college. We've been deeply involved in alternative and progressive education our whole lives. So, I mean, in some respects, it's sort of, yes, you can always do the Waldorf Montessori thing for your kids. That the High Mountain Institute was a place that I co-founded in Colorado, which combined kind of Knowles, like outward bound style, rigorous outdoor training with rigorous academics. Where There Be Dragons is another fantastic international travel adventure program that combines kind of PhD level folks with Peace Corps, with service work and other stuff. There's lots and lots of that. I think the key is decoupling student tracks of achievement, accomplishment, success, and admissions, right, with how adventuresome we're being with their education. And most places, the choke point is college admissions. So you can play all you want in preschool, you get a mulligan for elementary school, and by the time a high potential kid is getting towards 8th grade, typically, and this is gendered stereotyping, but it's the exceptions that prove the rule, is typically mother wants their child to be safe, loved, and explore. High achieving father basically abdicates early childhood ed to mommy, because that's the maternal still in the household, starts looking around 8th grade. Did they get in the right high school that gets them into the right power network college? And at some point they are unwilling to roll the dice on capping their child's professional networking and ultimate success on ascribing to any given philosophy. So it becomes a last hope versus a first chance for most learning talent. And so you always end up with these wonky, woolly schools that have beautiful ideals they never actually get to execute on. And again, apologies for all the glib shorthand and summarizing there, but that is based on 20 years of deep commitment in this space. And so in some respects, fucking hell, in 10 years, it's all going tits up anyway. So we will have, right, like it's not going to matter, right? I mean, college education, student loans, they're all upside down. COVID just jammed this down everybody's throats, so higher education is collapsing, public schools and funding is collapsing. And the real thing, it's easy knee-jerk white liberal TED fodder to be like the boy who built windmills, but like things like that, right? That story of that Central African kid who just figured out electrifying his village with spare parts and a bit of wound copper wire, like that kind of ingenuity, that kind of project-based learning, right? Like all those things are omnipresent around the world. And it's that kind of beautiful combination of autodidactic, like I teach myself because I need it, and some form of rootsy entrepreneurship. Like there was kids in the Philippines in some mega slums who, basically if you get a corner office, if you get a corner tin shed, you're good to go because you actually get natural light. But there's rabbit warrens of tin sheds. And so you might be in an interior one with no walls, no light. And they had all these plastic liter bottles, those wonderful plastic water bottles that I was washing up on the beaches. So they had an ocean trash problem. And then these kids figured out how to do skylights. If you fill them half full with water and you do a little bit of tin flashing and you punch them through the ceiling, right, for $1.50, they were selling those, right, as beautiful, natural, organic skylights and recycled ocean trash. And so it's easy to go Milton Friedman on this, and and the wonders of the free market. There's all sorts of fucked up things about late stage capitalism, but some combination of learning from necessity, discovery through joy, invention, and community service and self-service, like we're doing this because it helps us live better, I think is the natural substrate, and that is probably rising up to meet us. There's more needs for more things than our super abstracted post-Sputnik, let's all learn the periodic table, but the kids can't name 3 trees that are growing outside the window situations.
Ooh.
I'm thinking as well about your last comment on, well, what's the next 20 years look like? And how does that affect how we would actually educate our children? We're kind of making a bet there, depending on which educational stream you actually would choose. So it's really interesting thinking about that community aspect too.
Well, that is it Benigni, Roberto Benigni, the Life is Beautiful, that film with the father and the son in the concentration camp, right? To me, that I mean, broke my heart as a young father, feeling completely inept and incompetent. I'm like, well, fucking hell, man, if he can do it. Because I would be like, my heart ripped open with the existential angst of the world and be like, how can I be a parent at this time? And then you're like, oh my God. Now, granted, it's a story, but it's a good story. So I think that bringing children along in the wonder and the discovery and the adventure that we're on, like we're humans on this little blue marble, we're trying to figure it out. And, it's a little lumpy bumpy here, guys. As far as when you said the next 20 years, what does it bring? There's just a few things, at least the ones that stick in my head that really, they just require thinking. So one is most people's heuristics, rules of thumb, are linear. And what we're facing as far as environmental destabilization is geometric. So even in all the talk around COP26 and this and that in Paris and this and that, people are like, well, 1.1 degrees is where we are now. And then they're talking about 1.5. Well, that's only 4/10 more, right? Well, we could probably figure that out. And then some people are saying we're not even going to get close to that because, oh yeah, by the way, there's all this technology baked into us meeting the 1.5 that doesn't even exist and probably won't scale in the next 40 years anyway, like carbon sequestration and that kind of stuff. So the 1.5 was bullshit, but even so, it was a happy one. And then we're like, oh, it looks like we're sailing to 2 easily. And people are like, well, two's not even quite twice this bad. So that would feel sustainable. But in reality, right, we're not on a linear curve. So 1.5 could be 10 times as bad. 2 degrees could be 20 to infinity. It no longer matters to count. There's no one around to count anymore as bad. And so linear versus geometric as far as impacts. And we're seeing this with now reports of being like, there may be no snowpack in the Sierra Nevadas by 2040. And you're like, yes, that sucks for skiing. But what it really sucks for is the entire state of California, all of its agriculture and its entire population, because there's no longer a water table. And you're like, oof, that's heavy. The Bill McKibben piece from 2011, which still chills my bones, where he was like the cold math, I think, the cold math of climate change, something along those lines. And he's basically like, look, there's $27 trillion of fossil fuels under the ground already on the balance sheets and in the stock market of big oil. So we can either take them out and burn them as planned, which will trash the climate, or we can leave them in the ground and destroy the economy. Those are the choices. Now, obviously, we can make arguments for mobilization, Kuznets curves, S curves, migration from petroeconomies and all those kind of things, except that, Biden is now sold more oil and gas than Trump did. And he just did the largest oil lease 10 days after COP. Right. So you're like, okay. And the reason why is because we can't get inside our own fucking OODA loops. Right. So climate change is exponential, but decadal to millennial. Right. And quarterly stock reports and biannual, election cycles, 2 or 4 years, right, always capture behavior decisions on markets and governance. So we can't get inside the OODA loops of our markets and our governance to make any changes that lie further than a quarter to 18 to 24 months, which leaves us perpetually doing sociopathic, dumbass things. And there was another one. There's 3, I think, in my brain somewhere, but I reckon I've already bummed you out enough, so I'll stop.
And I mean, I'm hearing a nice description of game A dynamics there. So I'd like to invite Ron to share his question.
Thanks. Hey, Jamie, great to see you at the STOA first. Yeah, you had mentioned the longing for game B, and there's one thing I've heard you talk about on the whole game A, game B framing. It really caught my attention. And of course, correct me if I'm not paraphrasing correctly, but you've talked about how we shouldn't just look at game B as something just completely new. We're creating like some new world, but that the roots and seeds of the infinite game and game B type stuff has been in civilization for eons, including, I think you've said, Western civilization. And I also even think I remember you pointing to the founding fathers in the US. Some ideas I wonder if you maybe even gotten pushback on, because there is that kind of let's burn it down and start a fresh kind of vibe. So, I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit. And particularly, I'm interested in how you would talk about navigating the sweet spot between the urge to create this new world, which often goes awry. I think you've spoken about that as well, and being, appreciative of what's being handed down through the ages, even in so-called Western civilization and modernity, which is getting a lot of heat these days in some circles.
Yeah, I mean, like same as it ever was, same as it ever was. We're people. The sun comes up, comes down, there's photosynthesis and there's metabolism, right? And we're all just playing this game of moving matter around and trying to remember enough of our shared purpose and reason for being that we can make art and bear witness as we do this thing. So I think it's honestly, there's a huge case for sort of techno retro romanticism, not in a noble savage, go back and strip mine the remaining indigenous wisdom that we haven't trampled and extracted already. Like not that, just more like reclaiming our own and just putting down the roots. Like nobody fucking knows. Like everything is polarities, everything is trade-offs, everything has externalities and unintended consequences, and we can't even solve the 3-body problem, in physics of just mapping 3 rotating objects, right? Blah, breaks our math. And so like, whiz bang things like holacracy or DAOs or any of these things on governance, none of them fucking work. They just fuck up differently, right, than the existing hierarchical tops down. It's like parenting. You're going to do the Ferber versus the Sears method. Are you going to let your baby cry themselves to sleep, or are you going to pick them up every time they cry and and meet all of their needs? It's as our friend Diane Hamilton, the Zen teacher, said, you wound your child either way, right? And we're even having this experience back to the education question, right? I mean, we're having this experience with our own children, dear friends of ours with their children, which is if you never jack your kid into the matrix, right? The most progressive alternative education possible. They're always seen and met and treated as sovereign humans. You fuck them up entirely when they hit adolescence. They feel like a complete misfit toy, and they literally think, I think my parents were delusional and psychotic because no one out fucking here it bears any resemblance to the world I just was in. And if you if you plug them into the matrix to try and teach them how to win, you fuck them up too, because then they have to go through that dissociative event of chasing all the brass rings and realize you can't live. So my sense is really like pick a patch of land, pick your sacred spots, till the ground, know where you're at a minimum, like, and support your community, like know where your food comes from, know where your water comes from. Who do you want to break bread with once a week at a potluck? You know, what are your children like? Be in each other's lives and be uncles and aunties and like reknit this shit. And 90% of what we have to do is ancient and timeless. 10% is like, you know what? Burning sticks inside with no chimney wasn't that good for our health. And we need light and we need cooking sources. And we've got some cooler ones. We can do solar ovens. We can do battery banks. We can do, you know, and communication doesn't have to be smoke signals. It could be ham radio or even a fancy pants internet. Like, but I would just constantly loop it through. In fact, another kick-ass inspirational book is called Gaviotis, The Village to Reinvent the World, about a Colombian off-the-grid sustainable community that did like seesaws to pump water, you know, kids seesaws on the playground, pumped water for the hospital, like amazing genius stuff. And they sowed pine trees to grow in the alkaline salt flat desert because it was one of the only plants that would grow. And they grew a huge 80-foot tall forest over 20 years that then brought back, reactivated the rainforest seed and drew back grazers and flora and fauna and all. It's like literally turned it back into a garden, dealt with drug traffickers, the whole bit, like real harsh, real world ingenuity over generations and time. So that's it. I think I'm super massively suspicious of dudes on the spectrum insisting that we reinvent civilization from scratch before we take a goddamn step towards anything, right? They've just spent too much time in Sim City and being dungeon masters in middle school. And it's really, really time to like connect the dots and connect the roots and the shoots, which goes back to the Wendell Berry, like trust women more than men.
I'm hearing echoes of the thinking versus acting polarity as well. Like, how much could we redesign civilization just through talking about it? I'm going to pass things over to Kevin, and I think this might be our last question. We've got about 6 minutes left today, so Kevin, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Jamie. This kind of relates to what you were just saying. I wanted to double click on what you said about the mythopoetic vacuum. So the solutions you just kind of gave to Ron's question about, finding a community and doing all that kind of stuff. But they all seem very practical. I'm wondering, do we need to kind of like address convey it in a mythopoetic way? What would that mean to do that? Is that part of your solution, like in terms of communicating it? Like, are there like old traditions we can go back on, or like, I mean, that term you threw out, what was it? Techno retro romanticism. That sounds pretty mythopoetic. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how this idea can be communicated to like permeate throughout the public consciousness.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, we look at Avatar, Star Wars, The Matrix, like we clearly deal in mythopoetics, whether they're on, papyrus or carved into stone or flipping around on celluloid or an MP3, right? So we are steeped in them, and stories that serve and stories that speak to our reality, but also our possibility are arguably more essential now than ever. What are the stories that are flexible and also feel timeless, but also lead towards a future we can actually hit? As a complement to Recapture the Rapture, instead of doing a marketing campaign, we actually did a pilot on the infinite ARG, like an infinite alternate reality game, called Wyanon instead of QAnon, right? So it's like, Wyanon, don't do your own research, ask better questions, like Wyanon, like the question behind your questions. And we just told a ripping yarn of how that book came to be, which was actually, I mean, as it's intended, but it was, hey, if you're reading this book, we're the Omegans, we're from Teilhard de Chardin's Omega Point, like we're at the end of time. If you're reading this, it means it worked, right? You did the thing, but the thing is to decode these instructions, right, of how to self-initiate into anthropos and to how to become twice-born humans. That we're no longer trying to bypass, transcend this, or escape this earthbound mortal existence, because we came in the first time by accident, not by choice. But we do the Goethe thing of dying before we die, the Eleusinian mysteries, the core root initiation, and we come back Ebenezer Scrooge-like and say, fuck yes, right? Today's a new day. I have a new lease, and I'm no longer trying to escape, transcend, or bypass, or numb this mortal, earthbound experience. I am all in, as a dead man walking. Right? So I am here to practice resurrection. I am here to offer my gifts freely and joyfully. I'm here to sing my war song, but I'm also here to sing my love song. And to me, like, and that's Gandhi's Satyagraha, that's MLK's soul force. That's the whole premise and thesis of Recapture the Rapture. And if you don't read anything in it, please just read the last 7 pages, the conclusion. And it's that. It's like, fuck, guys, all the math doesn't look good. Really, really doesn't. But we know that, and we've known that for a while. And the only exponential curve that bends in the right direction is collective transmission of soul force. And whenever that's happened anywhere in the world at any time in history, it has sent shockwaves through time and space. And like, it's ours to play. And so if we think about it, like if this really is the infinite game, and if you subscribe to anything of persistence of consciousness, reincarnation, whatever, take your pick, but just anything that allows that somehow we had some input as to how we showed up in these lifetimes, fucking hell, wouldn't we have chosen the good one? Wouldn't we have chosen the one to bring it across the finish line at the 11th hour for all the marbles? And what an honor that is, what a responsibility that is. So it's sort of time to like stop sucking our thumbs and stop G'ing and being like somebody, nobody ever promised us a rose garden. But here we are. And if the last 50 years of late stage neoliberalism was a massive, colossal clusterfuck, we can still be thankful for the incredible prosperity and abundance that we came up in, even if it's in the rearview mirror and never to return. But it gave us the stability to think about and talk about trauma and our healing journeys and our introspection and all these amazing things, right, that have given us the most stable, most viable platform or base from which to step all the way up and do what's ours to do.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I hope that's all right, folks. And I mean, yeah, there's a kind of a map, my best, at least circa as of 9 or 10 months ago, on how to make our way through this in this most recent book. If you haven't come across it, please feel free. It's my honest to God, heartfelt effort to map this and also to signpost a way forward. And psyched for this community too, right? I really appreciate the sincerity and the sort of quiet groundedness of your guys' inquiry and the conversations that you're choosing to have and supporting with your community. So like, we also get to do the digital stuff, and this is one to acknowledge and be grateful for as well.
I had the sense that we're co-creating a little bit of that mythopoetic today, just shaping what that actually means for us in our lives through this conversation. So feeling a lot of gladness for you showing up here, Jamie. Thank you.
For sure. Much love, everybody.
Thanks everybody for coming here and for your great questions. Bye.